Ah, what a beautiful morning this time of the year. Just a typical normal summer. Hey yo, what's there? I should be good this time around. Hey you, do not do it. You're dead. If you say so. Take everything precious and any food he's got. Oh, and take his wife too. Sir, he doesn't have a wife, but he's got a brother. Well, take him too then. We don't discriminate here. You are literally taking everything away from me. Yeah, we know. Shoot him lots.
Їхав козак за Дунай, сказав дівчині прощай, ти конику вороненький, скачи та гуляй. Пості, пості, мій.
Jumping back in time into the 9th century, we can see the civilization that has given birth to the Russian and Ukrainian identities is the Kievan Rus that spanned from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Carpathian Mountains in the south after the conquests of Duke Oleg, who was able to control the two core centers, Novgorod and Kiev. The Rus people had an interesting situation when it came to choosing their religion, since they wanted to have a uniting factor among the local populations. They had a few different missionaries arrive to Yaroslav the Wise to pick from, and he had a choice from the Western European, later to be Catholic Church, Byzantine-based Orthodox Church, and Islam. He didn't pick the Western way of Christianity because a lot of the nobility wanted to keep their beards and remarry at will, and they did not want to pick Islam because they loved their wine and letting it go was not an option as well. So the obvious choice for them was the Byzantine-based Orthodox Christianity. A period of stability followed from the late 9th century to the middle of the 11th century, but after the death of Yaroslav Vladimirovich, who was previously able to consolidate the principalities after the previous internecine war, and he died assigning his 5 sons to rule over different portions of the Kievan Rus, resulting again in weak, constantly warring nations who posed no major threat to outside powers, nor had any protection from one. Do you hear something? Mongols invaded the Rus principalities in the mid-13th century, resulting in the sacking of Kiev and other cities who refused to give up and pay tribute to the horde. This resulted in a period of migration from the southern territories into the northern principalities, and many rump states who paid tribute to the Mongols called the yoke. This lasted for another century and a half until the year 1472, when Ivan III defeated the Mongols at the Battle of Alexina. But the Mongol invasions have left a big mark on the Russian principalities over the course of 2 centuries. Muscovy's rulers adopted the ways of the Mongols when it came to having a strong hand. Cool fact, among the Russian principalities exists the Novgorod Republic that had a system similar to the Polish Sejm, called Veche, where they elected their rulers, made new laws, and could put on trial their rulers. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Russia is experiencing tremendous territorial growth. After many Russo-Turkish wars, the Tsardom also gained sea access, and in 1648, Khmelnytsky's Cossack uprising happened. Cossacks are freedom-loving frontiers people like the Scottish who settled in the Appalachians. This resulted in the war with Poland, because Cossacks sided with anyone who gave them greater autonomy, which meant that the Tsar wanted to involve himself in eventually the Ukrainian territories on the left bank of the Dnieper, going to the Tsardom, and the Cossacks went under a protectorate. In the 18th century, Catherine the Great instituted the serfdom on the Ukrainian lands and extended rights to the nobility. During the partitions of Poland that resulted from the internal upheaval and an alliance between Prussia, Austria, and Russia, who divided up the Polish Republic, Russia acquired most of the Ukrainian territories except for Ukrainian Galicia, that was taken by the Austrians. During the Napoleonic Wars, however, Ukraine did not have any battles on its territory and was left unscathed by the conflict. During the 19th century, there were massive Russification efforts. Ukrainian literature was banned from printing and distribution. Ukrainian writers were suppressed, but at the same time it was the golden century of Russian literature, with many great writers coming out. Comes the Great War, and in 1917 the war is not going to Russia's advantage, with Russia having all of Polish and Lithuanian territories occupied, and Riga fell, as well as food production being hampered because of the farmers being sent into the battles. Unrest was brewing. Under the advice of the generals, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated in March. The provisional government that was set up following the abdication fared no better, which resulted in the October Revolution with Lenin and Trotsky overthrowing the government. The Bolsheviks signed the Brest-Litovsk Treaty that was signed with the Central Powers on March 3, 1918, and gave all of Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, and Baltic territories over to the German Empire. After seizing power, the Bolsheviks had loose control over the territories, and many Russians started uprisings in different parts of the country. During the Russian Civil War that followed, it involved all of the breakaway states from the Russian Empire, and after the November Armistice, the Germans had to renounce all their claims to the territories of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, which meant that the Soviets and the White Army tried to control Ukraine, but the lack of cohesion on the side of the Whites and them choosing not to recognize and guarantee their independence resulted in the Baltic Army having reduced numbers and failing in the attempt to take St. Petersburg, and the failure of the southern offensive on Moscow, which have pretty much guaranteed the loss of the White forces. In 1922, Ukrainian SR became one of the founding nations of the Soviet Union. After this came a period of continued Russification and decolonization. This policy accompanied with bad harvest seasons in agricultural regions and Stalin's continued exports of grains to foreign markets, by taking it away from the more or less established Ukrainian peasants, resulted in the Holodomor in the summers of 1932 and 1933 that resulted in an estimated 2 to 4 million deaths just on the Ukrainian territories. Many Russians succumbed to starvation during the Holodomor as well. The Ukrainian Senate, though, in 2006 considered this as a genocide against the Ukrainian peoples. This topic is a bit controversial since the Holodomor didn't only affect the Ukrainians, but other regions that were the agricultural base of the Soviet Union as well. But it was more severe in Ukraine since it was the main agricultural hub because of the Chernozem, the most fertile soil in Europe. The seeds of the Stalinist policies resulted in the alienation of the Ukrainian population that would come budding for years after. In Poland, during the authoritarian rule of Josef Pilsudski in the western Ukrainian territories, there was a process of Polonization and increased cultural suppression, which grew after the counter-terror of the Ukrainian nationalists toward the Polish populace, which turned into mass Ukrainian pogroms with more than 500 houses being set on fire. This was noticed by the League of Nations. As worthless as it was, it condemned the Polish actions towards the Ukrainians.
Сегодня в 4 часа утра, без всякого объявления войны, германские вооруженные силы атаковали границы Советского Союза.
During the beginning of the German special military operation into the Soviet Union to decommunize the population, many organizations and paramilitary organizations collaborated with the Germans, with the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists attempting to create a Ukrainian state under the German protectorate. But the Germans had other plans for them, with some leaders of their nationalist movements being sent to the concentration camps. After choosing between the two evils and seeing that the Germans were losing and the atrocities committed, many residing in Ukraine chose the lesser evil that at least did not want to wipe them out and replace locals with an Aryan race. Thus, many partisan movements started in the country under coordination from the Soviet command, but some were just fighting both sides. There were many atrocities committed, not just by the Germans, but by the Ukrainian nationalist groups as well, with plenty of Jewish communities being wiped out, with 100,000 killed just in Kiev, in a place called the Babi Yar, and local Russian communities targeted too. Following the Great Patriotic War, rebuilding process began. A lot of the cities were heavily damaged and the countryside ravaged. Ukraine, in the Soviet Union, like in the Russian Empire, was the jewel of the crown, with many rich agricultural lands, a big industrial base, and manufacturers for strategic purposes. A lot of the parts of the Soviet planes, including their engines, were mainly made in Ukraine, with some other parts made in the different corners of the Soviet Union participating in the production chain. Also, in 1954, Khrushchev decided to transfer Crimea from the Russian Soviet Republic to Ukrainian SSR, not based on ethnic lines, but rather due to it being reliant on the electrical supplies and water sources coming from Ukraine through the Crimean Canal that Russia actually took in the first few days of the war. The Soviet spies were able to infiltrate the American nuclear program and facilitate the production of the first Russian nuclear weapon that was tested in 1949. The period of American security lasted for almost a decade more, because these nuclear weapons had no easy way to reach the North American continent without a ballistic missile carrying it. During the Cold War, though, the Soviets have stationed many of its nuclear weapons on the Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Kazakhstan territories. During the 70s, there was a stagnation period in the Soviet Union. The Soviets made it even worse by invading Afghanistan, which resulted in the worldwide condemnation and OPEC members ramping up their oil production that devalued the cost of the Soviet oil, which was one of the main exports since most of the technological products were kept inside for security reasons. Thus, the Soviet coffers were running low. Following the Chernobyl accident, Soviet Union spent massive efforts to contain and decontaminate the area of Chernobyl to prevent the nuclear waste from the reactors from getting into the Dnieper River. Main reasons for the dissolution of the Soviet Union was the dire state of the economy, accompanied with the Gorbachev policies. Glasnost, as it's known in Russia, is a process of liberalization of the press and incorporating freedom of speech. This was a necessary step and one of goodwill, but this led to many dissident talks and negative opinions getting out there. Some experts say that if it would have been done a couple of years after the economic policies would have given results, then the Union could have been preserved and would have worked similarly to the Chinese model. But instead, many infuriated opinions got out and nationalist movements sprouted in the republics, mainly in the Baltics, Western Ukraine, and the Central Asian republics. Many military generals wanted these to be suppressed or at least jail the independence proponents, but minimal efforts were taken. Gorbachev tried to create a new union treaty that would have reformed the Soviet Union into a union of Soviet sovereign republics, with the plan almost coming to fruition after the referendums in the republics were done, with 76% of the people who voted yes in 9 republics in total who supported the treaty, except for the Baltic states Moldova, Armenia, and Georgia, who decided to boycott it. But there was a hardline communist coup in August of 1991, which halted these processes. These hardline communists also wanted to revert to Gorbachev's reforms and stop the dissolution process that everything was leading to, but they had no major public support from the people, and so the movement quickly lost its momentum. Ironically, they accomplished the opposite of what they wanted. After this moment, the train was already unstoppable and on the way to fly off the tracks. Without popular support, with the economy failing and soldiers disobeying orders to suppress the riots, as well as Gorbachev not wanting to spill more blood to stay in power, he let the Soviet Union dissolve, with Ukraine declaring its independence on August 24th, with other republics following after. And thus on December 25th, 1991, the Soviet Union was no more.
Achoo! Achoo!
Achoo!
Achoo! Achoo!
Many country leaders did not want the Soviet Union to dissolve, including the President of the United States, because of the fear of the wars and conflicts that would have came afterwards. Just look at Yugoslavia, who was 10 times smaller population-wise with no nuclear weapons, but had many unresolved ethnic tensions and problems that were mismanaged with the previous administrations, which led to many conflicts in the Yugoslavian region from 1991 to 2001. Many feared that the dissolution of the Soviet Union would have been like a Yugoslavian Civil War 2.0 on steroids with a little bit of a nuclear taste. Luckily, things turned out relatively peaceful with minimal bloodshed, but other nations were still wary that some post-Soviet states had now 3rd and 4th largest nuclear stockpiles, with an uncertain future with possibilities of juntas utilizing them. To deal with that issue, the Budapest Memorandum was signed between Russia and the post-Soviet states, as well as the members of the Western countries like France, UK, and USA. This memorandum prohibited the signatories from infringing upon the sovereignty of post-Soviet states and returning the nuclear stockpiles to the Russian Federation. Ukraine was putting itself on a democratic path with following elections that were more or less fair. Many reforms came in place, but not enough. The very needed economic reforms that happened in Russia partially took place in Ukraine, and what was hoped to be a prosperous democracy came to be an oligarchic state that has the lowest GDP per capita in Europe, comparable to countries like Namibia and Suriname. But at least not like an oligarchic autocracy like Russia is, looking at you, Putin. After the end of the Soviet Union, every post-Soviet country, excluding for Baltic states, have joined the Collective Security Treaty Organization, a Russian version of a Commonwealth, and a defensive military alliance which Ukraine was also part of until 2014, and quit after Russian Green Men annexed Crimea. Many in Ukraine, before the annexation of Crimea, were very divided in their opinions, whether they wanted to be with the smart or the beautiful, not knowing if they want to side with the Russians or the EU, because they had a very interconnected economy with Russia, cultural and linguistic ties with them. But at the same time, they wanted to join the EU to strengthen their economy, and for some, post-traumatic Soviet disorder played a role. Jump to 2013, and there was an ongoing process for joining the European Union, beginning with visa-less travel to the EU and other integration processes. But suddenly, Yanukovych, then president of Ukraine, took a 180-degree turn and halted these deals, in turn going for closer ties with Russia. Many college students came out on a peaceful protest for many days, but on one night when the protesters were tired and were already planning to go home, President decided to use the police to disperse this crowd, thus resulting in his deposition in the later months, with bloody protests that killed 83 people and injured many more. This resulted in the Russian annexation of Crimea, with the troops that were sent in from the naval bases that Russia had in Crimea, and with the troops that fled in the beginning of an 8-year-long proxy war that later turned hot.